page 1202. We were just barely into the apology. And I really wish this book had included, I think this is mentioned in one of the footnotes, the Phaedo, Phaedo, which is Socrates' discussion after the apology with Plato and a character named, a guy named Phaedo and such, and a few others, about why he's not afraid to die. Okay, and it's in that dialogue that we hear that Plato and others have essentially bought off a guard who would allow Socrates to leave Athens. And he essentially says, why leave Athens? Just as well die as leave Athens, essentially. But we're not to that point yet, but I wish they'd included that, because we would have read it also, because it informs a lot of what he's going to say later on here about the immortality of the soul and why we should not fear death and such. So we're going to pick up on 1202 at the middle of the page. He has said earlier, there's really two kinds of charges I have to defend myself against. There are the early charges and the latter charges. The latter charges are the charges brought specifically by Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Okay? The earlier charges, he says, are the charges all you judges have grown up hearing about me. Okay? He's 70 years old. The implication is the judges are younger, and that he remembers the judges when they were little children. He says, you have been raised hearing these ideas about me. So what's he essentially saying to the judges about those earlier charges? What must he try to do with the judges' minds? Louder?
Persuade them.
Persuade them of what?
Their bias.
Yes. Persuade them of their bias. He has to try to unbrainwash them. Okay? Or, another way to put it, to re-brainwash them. To wash their brains clear of all the biases that Socrates believes they hold against him. So, he says, 1202, I will begin at the beginning and ask, what is the accusation which has given rise to the slander of me? Let me sum up their words in an affidavit. Here's what Socrates says is the affidavit against him. Socrates is an evildoer. So that could be one of the charges against him. And a curious person who searches into things under the earth and in heaven and makes the worse appear the better cause. And he teaches the aforesaid doctrines to others. He says, this is the accusation. It is just what you have yourselves seen in the comedy of Aristophanes. He's talking about Aristophanes' The Clouds, okay? Which in one version of my syllabus I actually had assigned. I had no idea how we would get to it, so that's why I dropped it. In which there is a man whom he calls Socrates. See, they didn't have the laws in Socrates' day about, any person bearing a resemblance to somebody living or dead is entirely fictional. A man he calls Socrates, going about and saying that he walks in air, talking a deal of nonsense concerning matters of which I do not pretend to know either much or little. Not that I mean to speak disparagingly of anyone who is a student of natural philosophy. In Aristophanes' play, Socrates talks about what's called natural philosophy. That is, the philosophy of nature, of things, of stuff. That's not what Socrates talks about. Socrates talks about moral and ethical philosophy, and to some extent, epistemological, how we know what we know. Okay? So he says to his audience, speak. Okay, and he's pointing out to the judges, you speak. You who have heard me, and tell your neighbors whether any of you have ever known me, hold forth in few words or in many upon such matters. ... You hear their answer. What's the answer? Silence. Nobody stands up and says, yes, I've heard you speaking about this. So he says, from their silence on this, you can judge the truth of that charge. So there's one done away with. As little foundation is there for the report that I am a teacher and take money. It's the and take money part that's really most important, but it's also the teacher. This accusation has no more truth in it than the other. Okay? So he talks about what he has gone about doing. And he talks about another philosopher who is paid and such. 1203, about, I don't know, a dozen lines down from the top. Speaking about sons, children. As they are human beings, whom are you thinking of placing over them? Is there anyone who understands human and political virtue? Okay, he's relating this in connection to this other philosopher who used a story. He says, you must have thought about the matter, for you have sons. Is there anyone? There is, he said. This is Parian saying this. Who is he? Said I, and of what country? That is, who would you put in charge of your sons for their education, and where is he from? And what does he charge? Evenus, the Parian, he replied. He's the man. He's the one I would put in charge of my sons. And he charges 5 minae. Happy is Evenus, I said to myself, if he really has this wisdom and teaches at such a moderate charge. Had I the same, that is, if I had his wisdom, I should have been very proud and conceited. But the truth is, I have no knowledge of the kind. Knowledge of what kind? He has no knowledge of what? Wisdom. See, Socrates is saying, in order to be a quote-unquote paid teacher, you have to know what you're teaching. They charge me for being a paid teacher of wisdom. And yet, what is he trying to prove by going around asking questions? That somebody knows more than he does, that he has any wisdom, because he doesn't believe the oracle. So he says, yeah, but somebody among you will reply. Yes, Socrates, but what is the origin of these accusations which are brought against you? That is, okay, what you're saying there is true, but why are people bringing these accusations? There must have been something which you've been doing. All these rumors and this talk about you would never have arisen if you had been like other men. See, there's the problem. He's not like other men. Wow, this is really relevant today. Tell us then, what is the cause of them? In other words, why aren't you like other people? What does he mean? That he's not like other men. He's not talking about other teachers going around and supposedly teaching wisdom. See, he's going to distinguish between himself and all other men of Athens, okay, in terms of a behavior that he has practiced, honed, okay, and what he seeks out of life compared to these others. He says, men of Athens, this reputation of mine, skipping a few lines, has come of a certain sort of wisdom which I possess. See, he doesn't say I have no wisdom. He says I have a kind of wisdom. If you ask me what kind of wisdom, I reply, wisdom such as may perhaps be attained by man. To that extent, I am inclined to believe that I am wise. That is, wisdom anyone can attain to. Notice, it's not immediate. Okay? So here he says, don't interrupt me. Let me finish. I got to make my point. Here, O men of Athens, I must beg you not to interrupt me, even if I seem to say something extravagant. There's that verb again, seem. By using the verb seem, he's saying, I'm not saying something extravagant. It might seem that way. Okay? For the word which I will speak is not mine. He's kind of saying, as God is my witness, I will refer you to a witness who is worthy of credit. That witness shall be the god of Delphi, Apollo. So, if you don't like what I have to say, take it up with Apollo. He will tell you about my wisdom, if I have any, and what sort it is. You must have known Chaerephon. He was early a friend of mine. He says, well, Chaerephon, as you know, was very impetuous in all his doings. Impetuous, rash, would jump into things. And he went to Delphi and boldly asked the oracle to tell him whether, don't interrupt, whether anyone was wiser than I was. Notice what he's already said. Chaerephon was an old friend of mine. He took it upon himself to go to the oracle and say, is there anybody wiser than Socrates? He's been hanging around with Socrates. He's heard Socrates asking questions of people. And the Pythian prophet answered, there was no man wiser. Chaerephon's dead. That is, Chaerephon can't come up and be a witness. But his brother's here, and he'll confirm the truth of what I'm saying. So, why do I mention all this? Because I'm going to explain why I have such an evil name. In other words, you wanted to know why these accusers came up against me. I got to go back to the beginning. When I heard the answer, I said to myself, what can the God mean? What is the interpretation of his riddle? For I know that I have no wisdom, small or great. What then can he mean when he says, I am the wisest of men? And yet he's a God, cannot lie. That is, I'm not saying Apollo's lying or that he's wrong, because he's a God and I'm not. What Socrates wants to know is, what's the meaning of this? Socrates is the wisest man alive. When Socrates says, I have no wisdom, little or great. It's a riddle I have to figure out. Okay? So I reflected that if I could only find a man wiser than myself, then I might go to the God with a refutation. In other words, I could go to Apollo and say, look, here's one wiser than me. So I went to one who had the reputation of wisdom and observed him. I'm not going to mention his name. He was a politician whom I selected for examination, and here's the result. I could not help thinking he was not really wise, although he was thought wise by many and still wiser by himself. In other words, kind of like Inigo Montoya, saying, I do not think that word means what you think it means, when wisdom was being applied to this guy. Consequence was that he hated me. Well, think about it. Should I go? Oh, what the hell? Think of Trump. What does Trump do whenever anybody criticizes him for even the smallest thing? He gets on Twitter and lets both barrels fly. Why? He doesn't like anybody challenging what he says. This politician is exactly the same way. Okay? Consequence was that he hated me, and his enmity was shared by several who were present and heard me. Why would several present also share that enmity towards him? Who likes to hang around politicians? Okay, other politicians? Donors? For lack of a better phrase, suck-ups? People who are expecting some kind of patronage, power, prestige because of their relationship with that person. So what happens when you take down, or when somebody takes down the person around whom you are building your edifice of power and prestige? Well, you got to defend that edifice. So he says, I left him. Although I do not suppose that either of us knows anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is. Why? He knows nothing and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. That's why Socrates is the wisest man in the world. He doesn't know, and he doesn't pretend to know. He doesn't think that he knows. So he says, so I went to another who had still higher pretensions to wisdom. Conclusion was exactly the same. Made an enemy of him and those besides. Then I went to one man after another, being not unconscious of the enmity which I provoked. In other words, I kept going around aware I kept making enemies. And I lamented and feared this. That is, he lamented the fact that he was making enemies. And he feared the fact that he was making enemies. Because what happens when you live in a relatively small community and you eventually make everybody in that community your enemies? They want to get rid of you. And that's why he's here. But necessity was laid upon me. The word of God, I thought, ought to be considered first. That's the necessity. The oracle said, you are the wisest man in the world. The necessity was, I got to prove this. It's not enough to hear it. Okay? So, and I swear to you, Athenians, the result of my mission was just this. I found that the men most in repute, held highest, were all but the most foolish, and that others less esteemed were really wiser and better. After the politicians, so he starts with politicians. Why? They're the ones in power. They're usually held in esteem. He then went to the poets. Tragic, dithyrambic. Dithyrambic essentially means lyrical poets. Okay? And all sorts. So he starts at the highest form of poetry, tragedy, then lyrical poetry and epic poetry. He goes all down the list of poets. And he said, and there I said to myself, you will be instantly detected. That is, you're going to talk to one of these poets, and you will find out that you are more ignorant than they are. Because, I mean, even today, what do we think? Oh, poets, writers, the intelligentsia, the intellectuals. They know everything. And all too often, they don't. Accordingly, I took them some of the most elaborate passages in their own writings and asked what was the meaning of them, thinking they would teach me something. Will you believe me? I am almost ashamed to confess the truth, but I must say that there is hardly a person present who would not have talked better about their poetry than they did themselves. Then I knew that not by wisdom do poets write poetry, but by a sort of genius and inspiration. And he's getting here at the creative spark. How did J.R.R. Tolkien, one summer morning, marking exams for entrance into Oxford, turn a blank page on a blue book and write, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, when he'd never seen the word hobbit before? How did that word pop into his mind? Or how did J.K. Rowling, on a train from Manchester to London, suddenly think about a boy who discovers on his 11th birthday that his parents were murdered by the greatest dark wizard who ever lived, that this dark wizard tried to murder him when he was a baby and is still after him? Okay? He's saying they don't write according to some plot based on wisdom. They write out of, what's he call it? Genius and inspiration. And when he uses the word genius, you got to understand the Greek idea of the daemon, or sometimes spelled this way, which is each person's kind of guiding, supernatural, so to speak, spirit. It's the thing inside you, okay, which tells you what you ought to be. It's the thing inside you which tells you when you're working a job that you just utterly hate, why you utterly hate that job. Or it's the thing inside you which tells you after you've been one major for a year or semester, it's not it. And so you switch. And then maybe you switch again, and then maybe you switch again, and maybe you switch again. Okay? Or careers, so that you don't find your quote-unquote vocation until late in life, as happens with some people. Because what's the difference between a vocation and an occupation? This is the thing that occupies you. In other words, it makes a slave of you. This is what? What word do we get from that? It's your calling. It's what you were meant to do. See, the genius, for example, of an oak tree is found in the acorn. Put the acorn in the ground, water it, nurture it, and what does it grow to be? An oak. It never grows to be an apple. There's something inside that tells it what it is to be. You can kind of think of the genius today, because of our scientific knowledge, as our DNA. But your DNA doesn't determine what you are called to do. Some people are called to be doctors. There's nothing else that will satisfy. Others, lawyers. Some politicians, unfortunately. Some teachers. Some, etc. The sad thing is when somebody doesn't find this, and they do a workaday job for 40 years and want to kill themselves every morning. Okay, so he goes on and says, they don't write by wisdom. They write by a sort of genius and inspiration. They are like diviners or soothsayers, who also say many fine things, but do not understand the meaning of them. Now, you could extrapolate from here to St. Paul. When St. Paul talks about, you've got prophets, teachers, etc., etc. But what's the thing about prophets? Prophets don't explain their prophecy. Prophets prophesy, and then somebody else does, okay, here's what that means. Okay? What's he saying? Poets don't know what they mean. It's just like poets get filled with the frenzy, the inspiration. They have the enthusiasm. Because what does that word literally mean? It means to be enthused. Enthused, past tense. What's this mean? It's not thus. Anybody know what word that's related to? Zeus. Engodded. To be enthused is to be inspired by the God. Okay? So when you have enthusiasm, it means what? You're kind of frenzied. You're filled with the God. Okay? Or gods. Yes?
Do they believe in Zeus or just Apollo?
No, they believe in Zeus. He's only going to refer to either the God or Apollo. I don't think he refers to... Yeah, and Hera. He does refer to Hera. So if you've got Hera, you've definitely got Zeus. Can't get one without the other. Okay, so he says, Then I knew that not by wisdom do poets write poetry, but by a sort of genius and inspiration. They are like diviners or soothsayers. Okay? That is, they read the mind of God, they speak it, but they don't know necessarily the meaning of what they say. The poets appeared to me to be much in the same case. And I further observed that upon the strength of their poetry, they believed themselves to be the wisest of men in other things in which they were not wise. Shut up. In other words, he's saying, because the poets are held up in such high esteem, they then do what? Okay? What else? Let's use modern world. Okay? Let's use our world. But let's not use poets, because we don't think much of real world poets anymore. Who has replaced poets? Actors. Okay? Or musicians. And what do actors and musicians, I'll go out on a limb here, tend to think on the basis of their acting and singing? That any of us really gives a damn what they think about anything else. Right? I mean, what is one of the problems one of the holes Hollywood has dug itself? They speak about themselves as being kind of the moral standard for the country. And then you have Harvey Weinstein, and Roman Polanski, and Woody Allen. And just wait till the pedophilia, dam breaks. What kind of moral standard is Hollywood really? Not so great. Okay? That's what he's getting at. That people who excel in one area think that they can then therefore do what? Talk about something else. Okay? He's not dissing the poets for their poetry. He's taking them down a notch because they take their prestige that they've earned from their poetry to then talk about something like else. It'd be like, if he were alive, bringing in Homer and having Homer talk about, atomic philosophy, the nature of things. Well, that's not Homer's gig. Homer's gig is what? Epic. Okay? Or it'd be like having Sophocles talk about biology. It's not his thing. Okay? So, he says, they believed themselves to be the wisest of men in other things in which they were not wise. So I departed, conceiving myself to be superior to them for the same reason I was superior to the politicians. Why was he superior to the politicians? Because I don't know anything, and I know that I don't know anything, and I don't pretend that I do. They know something about poetry, but they don't know anything about their own poetry. That is what it means, and they extrapolate to think they then know about other things. So, politicians, poets. At last I went to the artisans, craftsmen, skilled workers. For I was conscious that I knew nothing at all, as I may say, and I was sure that they knew many fine things. And here I was not mistaken, for they did know many things of which I was ignorant. That is, they knew how to make stuff. And in this they certainly were wiser than I. Talk to a woodworker, that woodworker has wisdom of how wood works, how grain works, etc. Talk to a potter. Potter understands the nature of clay. Okay? But I observed that even the good artisans fell into the same error as the poets. Because they were good workmen, they thought that they also knew all sorts of high matters. And this defect in them overshadowed their wisdom. And therefore I asked myself on behalf of the oracle, whether I'd like to be as I was, neither having their knowledge nor their ignorance, or be like them in both. And I said to myself and to the oracle, I'm better off as I am, knowing nothing and knowing that I know nothing. So he says, it's this inquisition, not the Torquemada kind of inquisition, but this just going around asking questions of people. He says, this has made me many enemies. And I'm called wise. Why? For my hearers always imagine that I myself possess the wisdom which I find wanting in others. In other words, they take my asking questions to be indicative of my wisdom. He goes, I'm just trying to find out. But the truth is, O men of Athens, God only is wise. And by his answer, he intends to show that the wisdom of men is worth little or nothing. He's not saying me personally, Socrates. He is only using my name by way of illustration. What does he mean? As if he said, he, O men, is the wisest who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing. You are the wisest of men if you know that your wisdom is nothing. And so I go about the world, obedient to the God, and search and make inquiry into the wisdom of anyone, whether citizen, stranger, who appears to be wise. That is, notice, he doesn't distinguish between man of Athens or barbarian. Okay? If someone's supposed to be wise, I'm going to ask him. And if he is not wise, then in vindication of the oracle, I show him he's not wise. Why? Because then he'll start to learn a little wisdom. By showing people they're not wise, he makes them what? Wise. And my occupation quite absorbs me, and I have no time to give either to any public matter of interest or to any concern of my own. But I am in utter poverty by reason of my devotion to the God. In other words, taking money? I don't do it. So, he says, there's another thing. The young men of the richer classes, that is, the upper society, they follow me of their own accord. They like to hear the pretenders examined. In other words, they like to hear those. Would you stop doing that? They like to hear those in positions of power what? Yeah, taken down a few notches. And they often imitate me. So they hear Socrates, and then they go out and do the same. And proceed to examine others. Plenty of persons, they discover quickly, who think they know something. See, this is why Socrates is in trouble. Not only does he go around asking questions, but now others have. Does anybody really in a position of power like people questioning their position of power? No. You know, what is the purpose of a university? What's the purpose? Yeah, I like the beginning of your answer there, Andrew. Well, what's the purpose of a university? Are you talking now, Dr. Sherman? Or are you talking 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago when they were first begun? Kind of like Hogwarts, by the way. Let's say at their beginning in now. Let's start with now. What's the purpose of a university or college? Does MTSU exist to make money for itself? Is it a for-profit school? No, it's not. It's a non-profit school. University of Phoenix is a for-profit school. Okay? So it's not quite that. It has a make money element to it, athletics. Okay? So why are you all here? Get a degree. Okay? So the purpose is to get a degree. Let's work backwards. Okay? Why do you want to get a degree? Bingo. It's jobs. That's what the 2017 purpose of a university is. It is to do what? How do you get those jobs? So what are you guys for future jobs? What's your relation to that mythical job? Worker, right? You're going to be the one doing the job. So, produce workers. What's another way of thinking of workers? And what's another way of thinking of the jobs? If I can draw one. Probably can't. Yep. Yeah, I knew I'd mess it up. Cogs. So now there's another wheel here. Cogs in the wheel. Cogs in the machine. Because what happens in an economy if we don't have enough workers? GDP plummets. What happens if you have too many workers? Then you have mass unemployment, etc. Okay? So the idea is to produce workers for society. Why? So that society can go on humming along nice and smoothly so that the people at the top remain the people at the top and we, workers, remain what? Workers. Okay? What's a university? That's what it is. What's a university supposed to be?
A place to educate, to be educated.
Okay.
To have a dialogue.
Place of learning? Dialogue? Okay. Learning what? How to punch keys? How to get in line at Nissan? Stand on an assembly line?
Specific learning.
How to file, stuff. I mean, entry level, the bank my wife works at, entry level file clerks now are required to have a bachelor's degree to be able to alphabetize. A bachelor's degree, which costs thousands of dollars, depending on where you get it. I mean, you could, fewer thousands of dollars, MTSU, Swanee, mega thousands of dollars, or, Vanderbilt, Belmont, 40 grand a year kind of thousands of dollars. Okay. So, learning what? Because, I mean, you are learning for this, right? Depending upon your major. Now, you guys are all nerds because you're all English majors or minors. Okay. Some of you might be recording interesting majors. But it's not accounting, because what are you learning in accounting? You're learning the theory of accounting and accounting. You know, kind of a thing. Okay? What's the difference between a college of liberal arts and a college of business?
Arts tries to teach you how to think.
Okay. Thinking. What's another name for the liberal arts? Another one-word phrase.
Humanities.
The humanities. What does the humanities refer to? Learning about the human condition. Man, that sounds like a textbook answer. Call you Hermione. Learning about the human condition. Or, these are what? All things that derive from humans. See, the humanities actually, I mean, when you come down to think about it, humanities encapsulates what? Everything. So, this technology, it's all part of the humanities when you think about it. The only thing that isn't is out in the desert, out in the forest, okay, the natural world untouched by humanity. Okay? So why do you study these? To learn about the human condition. How do you learn about the human condition? Learning how humans have existed in the past as well as today. So reading about them in the past, kind of wrestling with the ideas that they dealt with in the past and with the facts of the past and stuff. That's part of what Socrates is getting at in this whole apology. Okay? He says, lost my place here. That these young men went off and did this same kind of thing. And they quickly discover who think that they know something but really know little or nothing. And then those who are examined by them, instead of being angry with themselves, they get angry at me. Why? Because he's the one who they think sent these people off to ask these questions. See, the humanities are the things, are the disciplines that ask the questions not how, not can we, but why and should we? See, apparently there was no, I would say, real humanist around in the Manhattan Project in the late 1930s, mid 1940s, early 1940s. There was nobody there, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, who went to Robert J. Oppenheimer and said, should we? We know we can build this thing. Should we? Or after the atomic bomb, went to Edward Teller and said, I know you've come up with this theory of the hydrogen bomb, which is, the atom bomb on steroids. Should we? Okay. Everybody thinks Jurassic Park was pure fiction. It ain't. The science behind it is not pure fiction. I mean, the Russians are currently at work trying to come up with a way to revive mastodons, animals that have been dead since about 10,000 BC. Okay? One of the things that Crichton says in Jurassic Park, he puts in the mouth of Ian Malcolm. Maybe there's a reason there's 68 million years between us and the dinosaurs. Because a T-Rex would look at us and go, food. Okay? These are questions that need more asking. That's what Socrates is doing. Because if you don't have these, if you don't have this, and you only have this, what happens? Are many people in North Korea today asking, should we? Are many people in North Korea today going around to their superiors and asking these kinds of questions? No. Do they in the United States? Yes. Whatever your opinions are, okay, you know, student protests at various places around the country, I generally frown on them because of how they're conducted, not that they're conducted. Protests can be done properly. Shutting down other speakers is not proper protesting. I mean, I sent an email to the president a few weeks back because he sent an email out about these, I can't remember what its name is, this white supremacist group that put flyers on campus. Europa. Yeah, except it's Evropa. Okay? And he sent some email out about, we don't condone blah, 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 blah. And he mentioned, the Southern Poverty Law Center as one of the places that labels them as a hate group. And I just sent a nice little message off, said, Dr. McPhee, you might want to be aware that the Southern Poverty Law Center is not necessarily an unbiased group. They've been removed from the FBI and Department of Defense, for example, as purveyors or as kind of people you should listen to as who is and who is not an extremist. Because SPLC is itself an extremist group. Anybody even approaching the center of the spectrum gets labeled by them as a hate group, an extremist group. Okay? They're the ones who said, for example, what was it? Family Research Council, which is a pro-traditional marriage, pro-life group based in Washington. They're the ones who said that group was a hate group, which then caused a whacked out guy to go to the Family Research Council in D.C. to their offices with loaded weapons and start shooting the place up in 2012. So I just said, you might not want to appeal to them. You might want to appeal to, well, I don't know, the DOJ and the FBI. They've got, better groupings there. But does that mean if somebody wanted a speaker from Evropa to be able to address students on campus, that speaker should be shouted down? In a real one of these, no. This is the one place where Socrates should be allowed. This is the one place where every idea should be able to be expressed. Why? So that then counter ideas can also be expressed. Let the better ideas win. Let the stronger, better, channel my inner George Bush, persuader work. Okay? Let logic and rhetoric win, and truth win. So he goes on and says, I think I lost my place. Yeah, bottom of 1205. Says this confounded Socrates, they say, this villainous misleader of youth. And then if somebody asks them, why, what evil does he practice or teach? They don't know. They can't tell. That is, does he literally go about practicing evil? Does he disembody people? Does he chop up those that he finds to be unwise? No. He says, what do? They repeat the same charges, which are used against all philosophers about teaching things up in the clouds and under the earth. When the first Harry Potter book was published in the United States, what title was it given? Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Why? Because Arthur A. Levine, the American publisher, said, American parents are not going to buy a book for their children that has the word philosopher in the title. Because we're dumb. And even if you look at the American version of the Harry Potter books and the British versions of the Harry Potter books, American versions are a lot longer, page-wise. You know why? Fewer words per page. More white space. Because American kids are too stupid to read books with lots of words on the pages. Okay? Really angers me. Anyways, so he says the same charges are applied to all philosophers. That they make up things in the clouds and under the earth, that they have no gods, they make the worst things appear the better, for they do not like to confess that their pretense of knowledge has been detected. So he says, and this is why I've got these three accusers here. Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Miletus is angry at me. Why? On behalf of the poets. Okay? Anytus, on behalf of the craftsmen and politicians. And Lycon, on behalf of the rhetoricians. The rhetoricians are those who took money to teach how to use rhetoric to win an argument. Like you could buy the, book, How to Win Every Argument. It doesn't matter what the argument is. Take a speech and debate class or join a debate team. My daughter's on a speech and debate team for high school. What do you have to be able to do in debate? Argue any position. Okay, what does that mean? That means using rhetorical flourishes and devices. It doesn't mean appealing to truth. It means using your words in such a way that you, I'll go out on the limb, hoodwink others. Okay? That you trick them into agreeing or thinking with you. So he says, I have concealed nothing. I have dissembled nothing. That is, I haven't pretended one thing and meant something else. Okay, so that takes care of the first class of charges. Now let me turn to the second class. That is, these three individuals. They are headed by Miletus, that good man and true lover of his country. Notice what he's just done. He's praised his accuser. Why? It's a rhetorical device. I don't remember what it's called. But it's designed to put you in the goodwill of your hearers by praising the person who's accusing you. It's like when Shakespeare has in Julius Caesar, when Mark Antony delivers his great speech. Brutus said Caesar was a despot, and Brutus is an honorable man. Brutus said Caesar, and Brutus is a good man. Brutus said Caesar, and Brutus is a true and trustworthy man. And every time he says Brutus said, he then undercuts it. Even though he says, but Brutus is an honorable man. So, here's their affidavit. So we already read the first affidavit. Here's the affidavit now of his three specific accusers. It's something like this. It says that Socrates is a doer of evil, who corrupts the youth, and who does not believe in the gods of the state, but has other new divinities of his own. That's the charge. I corrupt the youth, and I don't believe in the gods of the state, but have my own. So don't believe in the gods of the state means what? He's an atheist. Even though it says, but he has gods of his own. Because he's going to take that thing apart in just a few moments. So, he says, this is the charge. Okay, I'm a doer of evil and I corrupt the youth. But I say Miletus is a doer of evil, in that he pretends to be in earnest when he's only in jest. In other words, I don't think Miletus really believes his own charge against me. So I'm going to prove it to you. Come on, Miletus, come up. Stand in the dock. I'm going to cross-examine you, essentially. So you think a great deal about the improvement of youth? Oh, of course I do. Okay. Tell us, what's the improver of children? What's the improver of the youth? He says, the laws. The laws make children good. He says, no, that's not what I mean. I want to know who the person is. Who in the first place knows the laws? Well, the judges. And he probably turns around, because notice what he's just done. Well, all of these wise, wonderful men here. So you say they can instruct and improve the youth? Yes. All of them? Or only some and not others? All of them. By the goddess here, that's good news. In other words, good. I'm glad to hear that these are all good, honorable men. What about the audience? Those sitting in the courtroom. Do they improve them? Uh-huh. All of them? And the senators? Yes, senators too. But perhaps the members of the assembly corrupt them. Or do they too approve them? See, there's Senate and the assembly. No, they improve them too. Okay, so then every Athenian improves and elevates them. Because you said all the judges, you said all the Senate, you said all the assembly, and you said everybody here in the courtroom. Everybody but me, right? So all of Athens but me. I alone am their corrupter. Is that what you affirm? That is what I stoutly affirm. Well, let me ask you a question. Horses. And you got to imagine Miletus at this point going, what? Does one man do them harm and all the world good? Is not the exact opposite the truth? One man is able to do good, or at least not many. The trainer of horses, that is. He does them good, and others who have to do with them rather injure them. Is that not true? Notice he doesn't answer this. You, Miletus, have sufficiently shown that you never had a thought about the young. Let me ask you another question. By Zeus I will. There it is. Which is better, to live among bad citizens or among good ones? Come on, answer, fess up. Do not the good do their neighbors good, and the bad do them evil? Duh. And is there anyone who would rather be injured than benefited by those who live with him? That is, don't you live with people who you think you're going to get some benefit from, rather than live with people who you think are going to harm you intentionally? Well, certainly not. That is, of course you don't want to live with people who are going to injure you. And yet when you accuse me of corrupting and deteriorating the youth, do you allege that I corrupt them intentionally or unintentionally? Well, intentionally. But you've just admitted that the good do their neighbors good and the evil do them evil. Now, is that a truth which your superior wisdom has recognized that's early in life? That is, you're younger than I am. And am I at my age in such darkness and ignorance as to not know that if a man with whom I have to live is corrupted by me, I'm very likely to be harmed by him? In other words, if I was going to harm somebody and corrupt that person, would I then want to live with that person? No. The logical person would say, no, that's not good. If you're going to live in some kind of society, you want to do good to those around you so that they will what? Golden rule. Do good likewise back to you. So you say, although either I nor any other human being is ever likely to be convinced by you. So, either I do not corrupt them or I corrupt them unintentionally. Either case, you lie. If my offense is unintentional, the law can't judge me on it, he says. So he says, okay, another thing. I should still like to know, Miletus, in what I'm affirmed to corrupt the young. I suppose you mean I teach them not to acknowledge the gods, which the state acknowledges, but some other new divinities or spiritual agencies. Yes. Okay, then by the gods of whom we are speaking, tell me in the court, in somewhat plainer terms, what you mean. I don't really understand. You affirm that I teach other men to acknowledge some gods, and therefore that I do believe in gods, and I'm not entirely an atheist. And yet the charge is that they are different gods. Or do you mean I'm an atheist simply and a teacher of atheism? You're an atheist. That's it. Why do you think so? Do you mean that I do not believe in the Godhead of the sun and moon, and you've got a footnote about Apollo and such? Okay. He says, I assure you, judges, he does not. That is, Socrates doesn't believe in this Godhead. Okay. So Socrates asks him some more questions and says, so you really believe, you really think I do not believe in any God? I swear by Zeus you believe absolutely in none at all. Okay. So Socrates says, nobody can believe you, end of the next paragraph, for he certainly does appear to me to contradict himself in the indictment, because he says, I don't believe in the gods, and yet I believe in some gods. Well, classical logic says A is not non-A. Okay? What's he saying here? He's saying, I can't be both. I can't be both an atheist and someone who suggests we should believe in other gods. Because atheist implies what? God. Meaning none, no gods. So, did ever man, Miletus, page 1209, third paragraph, believe in the existence of human things and not of human beings? That is, can you believe in the existence of a coat, which is made for human beings, and not in human beings, the makers of the coat? Come on, men of Athens, make him answer. Did ever any man believe in horsemanship and not in horses? Really? I mean, how can you have saddles if you don't have the thing to put the saddle on? There is no man who ever did. Can a man believe in spiritual and divine agencies and not in spirits or in demigods? That is it possible to hold those two ideas? He can't. Good. But then you swear in the indictment that I do that. Okay? The demigods or spirits are gods. And you say first that I do not believe in gods. And then again that I do believe in gods. That is, if I believe in demigods. So, you have put this into the indictment because you had nothing real of which to accuse me. You thought you could snag me on this. Okay? So he says at the top of 12:10, and this is what will be my destruction if I am destroyed. He's already said, I've already answered Miletus' charges. Not Miletus nor yet Anytus, but the envy and detraction of the world, which has been the death of many good men and will probably be the death of many more. He's saying, if I lose this trial, it's going to be because of this. It's not going to be because of these charges. Some will say, aren't you ashamed, Socrates, of a course of life which is likely to bring thee to an untimely end? Aren't you ashamed of a way of living that is causing us to have to kill you? That's really what he's saying. He says, a man who is good for anything ought not to calculate the chance of living or dying. He ought only to consider whether in doing anything he is doing right or wrong. That's why I've said several times, he's a moral philosopher. Is an action good or bad? Socrates says, if it is good, it ought to be followed, no matter the repercussions or consequences. If an action is bad, it ought to be shunned. Even if something, quote unquote, positive might come from that action. I'm poor. I have no money. An action says, steal. The result of that is I then have money. That is a quote-unquote good. It's not a real good, but it is a perceived good that comes from that action. Socrates would say, no, because the action in and of itself is bad. So he quotes a passage from the Iliad, and he says, strange indeed would be my conduct, O men of Athens, skipping 2 lines. If now, when as I conceive and imagine, God orders me to fulfill the philosopher's mission of searching into myself and other men, I were to desert my post through fear of death. Notice it's the long construction. He says, my conduct would be strange if Apollo ordered me to do this, and yet I refrained because of fear of death or any other fear. That would indeed be strange, and I might justly be arraigned in court for denying the existence of the gods. If I disobeyed the oracle because I was afraid of death, fancying that I was wise when I was not wise. Why? For the fear of death is indeed the pretense of wisdom. Why is it a pretense? Hamlet says in his great not soliloquy, Act 3, Scene 1, the to be or not to be speech, what does the fear of death do? He says it casts over resolution with pale, sickly thought. Okay? What does he mean? Whether 'tis nobler to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or with a bare bodkin to end them. He's saying, is it better to take one's life rather than to suffer all the problems of life? Well, what happens when you die? You sleep. Well, what happens when you sleep? To dream. There's the rub. For what happens in that sleep of death, or in that dream of death? He says, you go to that undiscovered country from whose bourne no one returns. What's the undiscovered country? What happens after death? It's that thought, what happens after death, that casts the sail, the sick, pale resolution, okay, on the determination to end one's life. Hamlet's suggesting there that when I think about ending it all I have to do is think about, but what happens afterwards? Because hasn't the everlasting fixed his canon against self-slaughter? That is, suicide. See, in the Christian tradition, suicide is the unforgivable sin. Why? Because you can't kill yourself and say, forgive me, Jesus. You can't ask forgiveness before you do the sin. It has to come afterwards. You can't kill yourself and then ask forgiveness. Right? What's he saying about death? For the fear of death is indeed the pretense of wisdom. Because what are you saying when you fear death? That you know what is behind the door. Death is what? For those of you who've read Harry Potter, what does Albus Dumbledore call it? Death is the next great adventure to the well-organized mind. Notice he hasn't really said anything about death. Doesn't say if it's to be feared or not. He just says, if your mind is well-organized, it's an adventure. What's he mean by well-organized? What Socrates is talking about. Okay? He says it is a pretense of wisdom and not real wisdom. Why? Being a pretense of knowing the unknown. Every one of us shows a pretense of wisdom every day when we leave this classroom. How so? None of us knows what is outside that door right now. We think we know on the basis of what was outside that door last Thursday and last Tuesday and every other Thursday and Tuesday before that. Or every class you had in your lifetime. You've walked out and it's been what? It's been just like the day before. And yet what happens on that one day, let's say not here, Virginia Tech, about 10 years ago, when it isn't just like that. See, it's a pretense of wisdom based upon experience. Okay? But experience isn't 100% accurate, is it? As a predictor of the future. Just listen to any stockbroker. What do they almost always have to say? Past performance is no guarantee of future earnings. Just because you've had a stock that gained 12% in the last year does not mean it's going to earn 12% next year. It might earn negative 6%. Okay? So, no one knows whether death, which men in their fear apprehend to be the greatest evil, may not be the greatest good. Notice what he's just thrown into the mix. Death might be actually something good for us. We think it's something evil. Why? Because we don't know. We don't know. Is not this ignorance of a disgraceful sort, the ignorance of which is the conceit that a man knows what he does not know? And in this respect only I believe myself to differ from men in general, and may perhaps claim to be wiser than they are. That whereas I know but little of the world below, that is death, I do not suppose that I know. What little does he know of the world below? Because bear in mind, what does he say? I suppose that I don't know. What little that he knows comes from what? Literature. Comes from the Iliad and the Odyssey. What happens to Odysseus? He visits the underworld. If this were after Virgil, what happens to Aeneas? He goes into the underworld. If this were after Dante, as we'll be doing starting next week, what happens? He goes into the underworld. Okay? But those are all what? Fiction. None of them is the true eyewitness account of my experience in death on the Star or National Enquirer reveals for the first time. No. He says, but I do know that injustice and disobedience to a better, whether God or man, is evil and dishonorable. It says, I know that, and I will never fear or avoid a possible good rather than a certain evil. He's saying it would be an injustice. It would be dishonorable for me to say something I don't believe in this trial just to make it so that I can live. No. Especially when I don't know what will happen once I die. So, if you say to me, Socrates, this time we will not mind Anytus, and you'll be let off. But on one condition. Quit your asking questions. In other words, we're going to let you go, but don't do this anymore. Who's that sound like, by the way? It's Peter and James and John in the beginning of the book of Acts. When they preach in the temple, they get arrested by the temple authorities. What? They get beat up, roughed up a bit, and they say, okay, we're going to let you go, but you got to quit talking about Jesus. And Peter's like, no, can't do it, sorry. Same kind of thing. Says, if you tell me you'll let me go on this, and if you're caught doing so again, you shall die. If this was the one condition you would let me go on, here's what I would say. Men of Athens, I honor and love you, but I shall obey God rather than you. Kind of like Antigone. And while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet and saying to him after my manner. Okay? Skipping several lines, same paragraph. For I do nothing but go about persuading you all, old and young alike, not to take thought for your persons or your properties, but first and foremost, what? To care chiefly about the greatest improvement of the soul. See, if he was one of those rhetoricians who got paid, he wouldn't be able to say that. He's saying, I care chiefly for what? For this individual's good. The good of her soul. And her soul, and her soul, and his soul, and her soul. He says, that's why I go about asking these questions. Why? Because what is the beginning of wisdom? According to the psalmist, it's the fear of the Lord. According to Socrates, it's the knowing that I'm not wise. It's humility. Okay? So, he says, whatever you do, understand. Bottom of that paragraph. I'm not going to change. Now, is this a rousing, speech to give to the people who hold your life in your hands to get them to let you off? No, not really. He says, but if you kill me, you will be injuring yourselves. So what has he just appealed to? Something that usually works with politicians. Their self-interest. He's appealed to the judge's self-interest. If you kill me, you will actually be harming yourselves. Nothing will injure me. He says, you can kill me, but that won't injure me. For the evil of doing as he is doing, Miletus, the evil of unjustly taking away the life of another is greater far. How will they be injuring themselves? They will become killers, not judges, Socrates is suggesting. Okay? He says, no, I'm not going to argue for my own sake. I'm arguing for yours, that you may not sin against the God by condemning me, who am his gift to you. What does he call himself? He says, I am a, it's what I am in the Department of English. Lone conservative, you know. I am a gadfly. What's a gadfly? Have you ever been stung or bitten by a horsefly? You know, it just won't stay away from you, buzzes you and lands on you, or a sweat bee or something like that. That's what he is. His purpose in life, he says, is to continually just kind of irk people, to irk society, to make it what? Try to be better. Just to, you know, when everybody's getting fat, dumb, and happy and comfortable, it's his job to go and stir things up a bit. Okay? He says, I am a sort of gadfly given to the state by God, and the state is a great and noble steed who is tardy in his motions. You're not going to easily find somebody else like me, he says. Therefore, you should spare me. You need me. He's essentially saying he's the conscience of the community. The only problem is, what role does the conscience have when you know you're not doing something right? Tells you you're not doing something right. Is it a pleasant telling? No. When you know you're doing something wrong, you want that conscience, just go away. Just be quiet. Let me do this. Let me indulge in whatever this is. Okay? So he says, and I know we're not getting through and we need to. When I say I'm given to you by God, the proof of my mission is this. This is 12, about a third of the way down. If I had been like other men, I should not have neglected all my own concerns or patiently seen the neglect of them during all these years. And have been doing yours, that is, things good for you, coming to you individually like a father or elder brother. In other words, if I hadn't been doing this, you think I'd be poor? You think I'd be wandering around the way I have been all my life? No. Some of you have heard me speak about this oracle, he says. And what is this oracle? This feeling he gets that tells him when he must speak. Okay? Let's see here.
Would that be equivalent to his damn?
Yeah, I think so. To his guiding spirit, kind of saying, okay, now's the time. It's kind of like, should I go there? Yeah, this will work. I read an article the other day, yesterday or the day before, about Jimmy Carter, who I generally don't hold in very high esteem. You know, remember living through his presidency was hell. But it was about how Carter desperately wants Trump to call him because he thinks he can solve the North Korea problem like he did in '94. Not. He didn't solve it in '94. That's the problem. Okay, but he desperately wants Trump to call him so that he can be used in some way. But in the speech, in this interview, he goes on and he doesn't come out and blast like Trump would blast, but he blasts the media and Democrats for being, his words, unfair to Trump. He says, I've never seen the media as hard on a president as our media is on President Trump. Okay? The media wasn't necessarily kind to Jimmy Carter, but it wasn't nearly as bad, he's saying, as it is on Trump. Okay, what is Carter for Democrats? He's the elder statesman. Yeah, I know you've got Obama and Clinton too, but I don't care your politics. Clinton's just out making money. I mean, he's just bringing in bucks hand over fist. Carter never did that. It's the big difference between Carter and Clinton or Obama. Carter has kind of this moral foundation that he never gave speeches for money. After he left the presidency, he said, I'm not going to do it. Reagan didn't do it either, by the way. I don't think the first George Bush ever did it either. Second one did, not much. But, Obama's not even a year out of office. He's already raking in $400,000 a pop. Okay? Clinton did the same thing. Carter has kind of served as what Socrates is talking about here for Democrats. Some just kind of go, Jimmy, just go away, please. You're doing what? You're rustling our feathers. You're making things more difficult for us. Okay, we're going to have to stop there. Way behind. Finish the apology, and we will attempt to do, because I'm going to skip, I think, quite a bit of the poetics, but just the apology and poetics for Thursday. Expect a quiz over the poetics by Aristotle. That way we should be able to start Dante for Tuesday of next week.